It was another busy Monday morning at the office. The hum of computers, ringing phones, and occasional chatter filled the air. Everyone was in their usual routine, heads buried in tasks, except for Emma. She was one of the receptionists, a quiet, hard-working woman who always had a kind smile for everyone, despite her growing baby bump. Emma had been with the company for about a year. She was polite, efficient, and always willing to help, but lately, her energy had been fading. Being 7 months pregnant and working long hours at the front desk wasn't easy, but Emma couldn't afford to slow down. Her husband Mark was out of town on business most of the time, and she wanted to prove she could manage on her own until the baby came. That morning, as Emma shuffled through paperwork and answered calls, Mr. Blake, the CEO, strode into the office. He was a tall, imposing man in his late 40s, with a sharp suit and a reputation for being ruthless. Employees often whispered about how unapproachable and demanding he could be. Emma greeted him with her usual warmth. "Good morning, Mr. Blake." But he didn't respond. Instead, he glanced at her belly, his lips curling into a faint smirk before walking into his office. Around lunchtime, Mr. Blake called Emma into his office. She hesitated for a moment, her nerves tightening. Stepping into his spacious, minimalist office, she stood near the desk, hands folded over her belly. He didn't even look up from his laptop. "Emma," he began, his tone sharp. "I've noticed your performance slipping lately. You've been slower, more distracted. Is it the pregnancy?" Emma felt a lump in her throat. She wanted to defend herself but didn't want to argue. "I'm sorry if it seems that way, Mr. Blake. I've been trying my best to keep up." He interrupted her with a dismissive wave of his hand. "Trying isn't good enough. If you can't handle the job, maybe you should take some time off. We can't have weak links in this company." Weak link. The word stung. Emma's cheeks burned with embarrassment, but she held back her tears. "I'll do better," she promised softly, her voice trembling. Blake leaned back in his chair, chuckling to himself. "Better? You'd better hope your husband has a good job, Emma. You'll need it once you're out of here." It was humiliating. She felt small, powerless, and deeply disrespected, but Emma simply nodded, excused herself, and walked back to her desk, biting her lip to keep from crying. The next day, Emma was tidying up some files when the office buzzed with whispers. A luxury black car pulled up outside, and out stepped a man in a tailored suit. He had an air of confidence, yet his face carried warmth. Emma froze as she saw him walk through the door. It was her husband, Mark. "Mark?" she whispered, wide-eyed. He smiled at her and kissed her forehead gently. "Surprise," he said. "I finished the project early and thought I'd come to see you." Before Emma could respond, Mr. Blake walked out of his office, his usual commanding presence filling the room. He extended his hand, assuming Mark was a potential client. "Welcome, I'm Thomas Blake, the CEO." Mark took his hand, but his smile faded as he glanced at Emma's pale face. He could sense something was wrong. "I know exactly who you are, Mr. Blake," Mark said, his tone suddenly firm. Blake looked confused. "You do?" "Yes," Mark replied, his voice steady but cold. "I'm Mark Evans, CEO of Global Ventures. We've been in talks to partner with your company for months now." Blake's face turned ashen. He had heard of Global Ventures, one of the most powerful firms in the industry. Mark's expression hardened as he glanced between Blake and Emma. "But before we continue any discussions, there's something I need to address. I've heard how you treat your employees, specifically my wife." Blake's jaw dropped. Wife? Emma is your wife?" "Yes," Mark said, his voice like steel. "And from what I've heard, your behavior toward her has been nothing short of disgraceful. Is this how you lead your company? By belittling hardworking employees?" Emma watched as Blake's usual arrogance crumbled. He stammered. "Mr. Evans, I had no idea." "That shouldn't matter," Mark interrupted. "You shouldn't need to know someone's connections to treat them with respect. Emma is one of the hardest working people I know, and she doesn't deserve to be treated like this." The office was silent. Every employee watched as the tables turned on their once untouchable boss. Mark turned to Emma, his gaze soft but filled with admiration. She stood there, her hands resting protectively on her baby bump, her eyes steady despite the humiliation she had endured just moments earlier. "You don't have to stay here, Emma," he said gently, his voice laced with concern. "You deserve better than this place. Better than him." He cast a sharp glance at Blake, who stood frozen, his once dominant presence now diminished into an awkward figure shifting uncomfortably. Emma's lips curved into a faint, determined smile. "Mark," she said softly, her voice unwavering, "I know I deserve better, but I won't let anyone push me out of a job I've worked so hard for. I'll leave when I decide it's time, not because someone disrespected me or thought I wasn't good enough." Her words hung in the air, powerful and resolute. Even Mark, who knew her strength, seemed taken aback by the quiet dignity in her tone. He reached for her hand and gave it a firm squeeze, his eyes shining with pride. "Fair enough," he said with a smile. "You've always known your own path." Mark turned back to Mr. Blake, his expression hardening again. The room had grown painfully silent. The once bustling office was now a sea of stunned faces peeking from behind desks and computer screens. Every word Mark spoke was deliberate, cutting through the tension like a knife. "You owe her an apology," Mark said firmly, "and not just a muttered one to save face. You owe her, and every employee in this office, a serious reflection on how you treat the people who keep this company running. Without them, you're nothing." Blake's face flushed a deep red, and for a moment he looked as if he might protest. But the weight of the situation, of who Mark was and the authority he carried, was too much to argue against. I'm sorry," Blake muttered, his voice low, his gaze refusing to meet Emma's. Emma tilted her head slightly, her calm demeanor making her seem stronger than ever. "Thank you," she said simply, though she knew the apology was more out of fear than sincerity. It wasn't forgiveness she was offering, it was closure. Mark stepped closer to Blake, his presence towering. "I suggest you make this a turning point, Mr. Blake. If I hear about this kind of behavior again, I won't just end any potential partnerships. I'll make sure your reputation takes a hit it won't recover from. Do I make myself clear?" Blake nodded quickly, swallowing hard. "Yes, Mr. Evans. Understood." Mark turned to Emma, offering her his arm. "Shall we?" he asked, a small, supportive smile playing on his lips. Emma took his arm but paused for a moment, looking around the office. The staff, who had been silently watching, now stared at her with newfound respect. She gave them a small nod, an unspoken message that strength comes in many forms. As they walked out of the office together, Emma's heart felt lighter. She hadn't just endured the humiliation, she had risen above it. Later that evening, Emma and Mark sat curled up on their couch, the soft glow of a table lamp casting a warm light over their living room. Emma rested her head on Mark's shoulder, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing patterns on her growing belly. The events of the day had left her exhausted but strangely at peace. Mark broke the silence first. "You didn't have to keep working there, you know," he said, his voice gentle. "I would have supported you no matter what." Emma smiled faintly, tilting her head to look up at him. "I know, Mark, and I appreciate that more than you can imagine, but leaving on my terms, it matters to me. Today reminded me that no one gets to decide my worth, not even someone like Blake." Mark kissed her forehead, a small, proud smile tugging at his lips. "You're incredible, Emma. I don't know how I got so lucky with you." She chuckled softly, her hand reaching for his. "I could say the same about you. Thank you for standing up for me today. I'll never forget it." The rest of the evening passed quietly, the two of them finding comfort in each other's presence. In the weeks that followed, Emma continued her work at the company, holding her head higher than ever. Though she had chosen to stay for a little while longer, she noticed subtle changes in the office environment. Mr. Blake, once feared and disliked, had become noticeably more cautious in his interactions. He no longer snapped at employees or dismissed their efforts, while his pride had certainly taken a hit. It seemed the incident had left an impression on him as well. Emma's coworkers, too, began to treat her differently, not out of pity, but with admiration. Many had witnessed the confrontation that day, and Emma's quiet strength had inspired them. As for Emma, she carried that day with her not as a wound, but as a reminder of her resilience. She didn't just endure the storm. She stood tall in the midst of it, and with Mark by her side and a new chapter of her life just months away, she knew that she could face whatever came next. The power of love, respect, and self-worth was a lesson she would carry forever, and one she hoped her child would one day learn from her story.